Good morning, and this is one of those very remarkable days that we cherish at Yuvatha, because we reached at one of the milestones, something that we consider as a milestone, a long-held work that we've been working from since like 2020 onwards. And this is the last and final of the 6-volume series on Malabar. And as I'm very sure that all of you know, specifically what is the focus of the series that we had, it is nothing but map what is being left out, what is being skipped over in the otherwise documented history of something that happened around us in the world that we live in, specifically in our geographical area. And in that attempt, when we were mapping what is left out, we were like being introduced into new struggles that normally a historian might have met with in their works. And throughout this process, we were looking for the apt person to release this work. And we found Butalia's life, not just her work, the whole life that what we get to read over the internet. That is something absolutely resonating with what we were trying to look at, or a person that we were looking for. And this is the kind of effort that we were kind of like trying to equate with what she did. Normally, in my estimation, when we try to pick up something that is glossed over, something that is skipped over, we find two instances. One, when the language fails to capture it, we miss it out. When the language defies to account it, we miss it out. The other instance is when people hesitate to narrate it, when people hesitate to articulate it, we miss it out. And two of these things had clearly happened in the case of Malabar struggles, when we look at. And we found, when we were kind of like connecting this, or when we were trying to draw the larger picture, we found Padma Shri Butalia's work exactly focusing on the same kind of void, fill that gap, or bridge something that has been lost in the same format, where people hesitated to articulate, the reluctance to articulate that, if I remember her usage correctly, or the problem with the language when we politically motivated or unconsciously use certain words instead of certain words. I think Butalia had specifically focused on the use of the word partition, how it fails, if my memory is correct, how it fails to capture the subtleties that went unnoticed when it comes to the individuals and their experience of the whole event, whatever we call what happened at that historical juncture. Similarly, when it comes to the instance of Malabar struggle, we found the same issue pertaining in our context, the use of the language being very political, the selection of words, even like the use of the word riot, rebellion, the selection of the reference term itself being very politically charged, and one has to be very conscious when they use that language, and the politics of language, the nuances of language when we try to re-articulate these things. That was one of the focus. And then the other thing, excuse me, the other thing, when people had these stories, if I remember correctly, somewhere you mentioned in your New York Times article, if my memory doesn't fail me, it was in your New York Times article where you quote James Young on his formulation of the Holocaust, where people over generations, when they story it down into their younger generations, how this being, who is being told, who tells, in what context, addressing whom, the story changes. It camouflages into unprecedented formats, and unprecedented priorities comes over. If it is not too bold, I would like to put one of my personal experiences when one of these discussions happened in 2021 about Malabar struggles. This was in a village context, and one of the Muslim, if I want to focus on the issue, one of the Muslim man was recollecting the 1921, and there were two Hindus present at the shop. It was a barber shop, and there were two Hindus present at the barber shop, and he was carefully narrating this so that the Hindu sensibility is not offended. And I have heard this very person being very aggressively articulating this, not with any of those democratic carefulness or whatever. He was not confined with that in different context. So this is how memory, though it is not, I think, in again remembering your term, memory is not that pure, and there was some other word that you use. Yeah, memory is not always that pure and something else. So again, collecting things from the memory is a very daunting task, very meticulously done task, especially when it comes to the work that we have brought out. So we have a session, the next session is with the editors and contributors of the volume, so you will get to realize their experience of carefully crafting this work out. But here again, coming into our session, this session focusing on the presentations where we have the idea of bringing into visibilities what, whether it is an idea, whether it is a group, whether it is a geographical space, whatever, bringing it into visibility being a problem, and how printing or publishing can work as that, whether it is an act of empowerment, whether it is an act of retaliation, whether it is a form of revolution, whatever. Print can work as something in our context where people are consciously being erased, or people are by mistake being evaded out, whatever happens, but there printing has something to do. And this is what unites actually Yuvatha, us at Yuvatha, with Padma Shri Urvashi Butalia. So we hope we will have a discussion on that line. But before we go into ma'am's presentation, we have a word of appreciation and an introduction into this session from Dr. Nisar. Dr. Nisar is a faculty at this college, and he will, on behalf of the Department of History at Farooq College, he will have his words with us. So thank you.
Thank you, Noufal. Good morning, everyone. So being a discussion, it is not appropriate to speak before the speaker. So let me take this opportunity to extend my warm greetings and gratitude to Padma Shri Urvashi Butalia, because she has turned up all the way to address this gathering. And this gathering is actually a group with students, research scholars, the faculty members from various universities and colleges, and also public who has already gathered over here. And definitely I think that the session would be fruitful, because what we are going to discuss is the invisibility, silence, etc. Actually, the title, the very title of the book, published around 20-25 years back by Urvashi Butalia, is The Other Side of Silence. Actually now, where we are living now, we are actually, the silence is wrapped us. The other side of the world, a group of people are suffering from the collective silence of the world. It is in this context that we are discussing about the invisibility, about what is called silence, etc. And this is so political that we are gathered over here in this campus. And being a part of the Department of History for our college, I'm very happy to associate with Yuvatha Books, they have already published the 6-volume work on Malabar Revolt, where actually there are number of works published, articles, books are published, and the researches are going on Malabar Revolt. But thing is that this book, when you go through this book, what we find is that the revolt has been captured from various sources, not only the conventional archival documents, but instead the revolt has been captured and revolt has been reflected in this book, or documented in this book, from various other sources, from personal narratives, from songs, from drama, from other reflections in the society. So the book is special in that sense. So the history department has taken initiative to have a discussion on this context. And I'm not going to prolong my words, because we have to listen Dr. Urvashi Butalia here. After that, we'll have a discussion, because the faculty members, research scholars, etc. here. Because another thing is that for your information, actually, we the students or the research scholars and the faculty members who are working in the field of history sometimes forget see the personal memory, I mean memory of the, and we are not, actually there are much studies on the memories or oral histories. So it is one of the important area which is lagging behind, and we have to pursue, so that different types of histories would be created. That is essential. So this session would be useful. I believe that all of you will actively participate and for discussion and all other things. And I invite, with your permission, Dr. Urvashi Butalia for her presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. You know, and I have to thank Anwar, Farooq College, and particularly Anwar for being so persistent, because when he approached me to ask me to come, he sent me a WhatsApp message, and I never look at my WhatsApp messages. So it was lying in my phone for many days. And then finally, I think he called me, and then I said to him, please send me an email. It's the only way I can take things seriously. I realize email is also now very old-fashioned. But when he told me about your project to map the multiple histories of the Malabar struggle in 6 volumes, I found that project so exciting, so interesting, so fascinating, because it actually resonated so much with the sort of things that I have been working on and thinking, about how histories look different from the different perspectives that you look at them from, how there is a time when it becomes possible to explore a particular history in multiple ways. How there is not only one truth that comes out, and you can't actually say, okay, now we have done it and it's finished and there's no going back to this history. But also particularly the last 2 volumes, that is the one that you're releasing today and the one before that, really spoke to me, because your 5th volume, from what I understand, looks at literature, poetry, song, and so on. And in a sense, it starts to blur the boundaries of what is historical record and what are works of the imagination, and how those two can actually talk to each other, so that we get a more nuanced understanding of our histories. And the last volume, in putting together oral histories of a living history, or one that was a living history, because now I suppose many of the survivors have they've all gone, really, it's 100 years. But just that recording of that history, which so many of these histories, by not recording them, we have lost them. So in a sense, when I read that, I was really excited to read it and really grateful to be here. So today I am going to speak a little about my work as a publisher, but also some of the overlaps that it has with my work as a researcher. I won't call myself a historian, because I have studied history in my master's degree. I mean, I didn't take history, I did literature. But then I did another MA in South Asian Studies, in which history was my main subject. But really speaking, I'm not a historian, and I'm largely see myself as an interloper, as somebody who has a very deep interest in history, but who comes to it free of all the disciplinary boundaries that tell you that only this can be considered history or only that can be considered history, and who comes to it with a feminist perspective, that is, looking at histories from below, to start with the question of where are the women in these histories, which is a question that actually leads you to so many other absences. So that's really where I'm coming from. But as I said, I'm going to speak a little about the publishing. So, you know, when you live in Delhi, your horizon is very limited. One of the things is that the question of being in the capital city of the country, you think that the only things that happen are those things that happen around you. So you can spend your entire life being ignorant of so much else that is going on in the world around you, and yet feel very involved and very enriched by what is going on. So really speaking, your horizon extends to the capital city. And when you have the misfortune, as somebody like me does, of living and working in the colonial language, unlike many of you who are totally bilingual, I mean, I am also bilingual in the sense that my mother tongue, Punjabi, and my acquired language, Hindi, come to me very naturally. But they are not the languages in which I think and work. They are not the languages in which I write. And I feel that loss very keenly. So when you are constrained by this living in the capital city, working in English, really speaking, things are very limited. And the opportunities you get to expand your horizons are also limited to those. And I will tell you about a conversation I was having just before I left with a friend of mine who is a teacher at Ashoka University in Delhi. And she was saying to me, "Where are you going?" And I mentioned to her that I was coming here, and I mentioned the project that you were doing, and that I was coming to hear more about it, to be there at the release of the book. And she said to me, "You know, you're so lucky, because most of us who are teaching in national universities in the center never get to see what is going on in the areas that we call, within quotation marks, the peripheries. You are not a periphery, but from the center, everything that lies outside its remit is kind of, you know, seen as that." And I realized there that yes, she's right, that I am very lucky to have had this kind of exposure. And it has come to me, I think, in two different ways. One of them is through my work as a publisher, which has pushed me to engage with literatures and writing other than what is considered the mainstream. And through my work as a researcher, which has opened up worlds to me that I never even thought existed before. And I would like to talk a little about that today. So this coming year, Kali for Women, the publishing house that we began in 1984, will be 40 years old. Kali doesn't actually exist anymore. In 2003, we split that publishing house into two, and I started Zuban, and my ex-colleague Ritu Menon, who is Punjabi, married to Kerala, she started a publishing house called Women Unlimited. But we still see the legacy of 40 years. And Zuban, the publishing house that I work with, will be 21 years old. So we call ourselves 21 going on 40. And we hope we'll be around for much longer, but who knows. Now, when we began that publishing house, we began with a very simple premise. And the premise was, I happened to be working in a publishing house. It was an accident that I fell into publishing. I had finished my master's degree in English literature from Delhi University, and much though I loved studying literature, I was so convinced that studying English literature had nothing to do with the life I was living. That is, Shakespeare and Milton and Keats and Spencer, of course they're great writers, they expand your horizons, but what do they have to do with the reality of India? So I was 100% sure that I did not want to teach English literature, which is the profession that was expected of women. So I was looking for work to do, and by chance, I landed upon a publishing house where there was some freelance work to be done. That publishing house was called Oxford University Press. It was in their Delhi office. And the moment I walked in there and saw the books, I fell in love irrevocably with the books, with printing presses, with paper, and I decided this is what my life is going to be. And I have stayed with that since then. What happened was that I was very involved at that time in the women's movement in India, and we were mobilizing on issues of discrimination against women all the time. We were fighting against sexual violence, we were fighting against dowry, we were fighting against unjust laws. But every time we entered a battle and a campaign, we realized how ignorant we were. Because instinctively, at a gut level, we knew it was wrong. We knew violence against women was wrong. We knew dowry was wrong. But at a deeper level, we understood nothing about why it took the form it did, where did it come from, etc. And so at that time, in the 80s, when there was no internet, when the only form of knowledge was in books, we started looking for books on the histories of dowry and so on and so forth, and we found nothing. There was one short book by two writers called Stanley and Tambayya. That was the only book around to help us understand dowry. There was nothing else on anything else. So I went to my bosses in Oxford University Press and I said to them, why don't we think of publishing books about women? And they said, women, but do they read? Do they write? What kind of things do they say, etc.? They're not serious. So I thought, okay, they're not going to do it, then I will do it myself. And that was when I decided to start a women's publishing house, a feminist publishing house. It took some years to do, but eventually we set up that publishing house in 1984. So as I said, that when we started, the premise was simple, and it was basically that we want to counter the existing world of knowledge by bringing into it knowledge about women, by women, and by changing that world of knowledge so that it will recognize women's knowledge as legitimate, as significant. And so we started to publish books about women and by women. Now it's very interesting, and this is why I say that the work that I've done on oral histories and that I continue to do is linked with my professional work and learnings. It's very interesting that when we started to publish books in English because that's the language in which we were educated and could work. But that meant automatically that we were publishing books by women who were urban, educated in English, therefore middle class or upper class, and therefore our horizon was very limited. So we could congratulate ourselves and say, we are countering the male monopoly of knowledge. We are countering patriarchy in knowledge. But actually, we were countering it only with the voices of the same women who belonged to the same powerful men whose voices were dominating, who belonged to those families. So we were making a small change, but it was not deep enough. It was very surface. And we began to ask ourselves this question, how can we, calling ourselves a feminist publisher in a country like India, be publishing only urban, middle class, upper caste, upper class voices? How can we do that? How do we move beyond this? Over the years, we learned to move beyond this purely accidentally. So I'm not saying that we had some strategy to gain knowledge, but it was a series of accidents, happenstance, that helped us to think more deeply and change. And I'm going to tell you 3 little stories about these happenstance things that helped us to realize that there was a world of knowledge out there beyond the city. and in the heads and hearts of poor, low caste women who did not operate in English and who did not live in the city. And I say this because when I started work on partition, it was exactly the same time as we set up our publishing house in 1984. And the partition work began out of a similar kind of trajectory where, having lived in India, at that time I was in my 30s, early 30s, and having been part of a partition refugee family, because both my parents were partition refugees, I had grown up listening to stories of partition the entire time in my family, but I had paid them zero attention. I just thought, these are old people, they have no value. History has taught us something, that's what we need to believe, that it was all Jinnah and Nehru and Sardar Patel and so on, that it was a battle between the Congress and the Muslim League, and therefore we didn't pay any attention to the stories our parents told us. The way partition played out in my mother's life was really deep and really profound, and it impacted her life till the day she died. But till 84, I had paid no attention to it. What jolted me into doing that was the death of Indira Gandhi, the assassination of Indira Gandhi in Delhi by her Sikh bodyguards, and the way in which the entire city turned against the Sikh population in 5 days of killing and looting and arson and so on. And this city, in which I had lived pretty much all my life, we came to Delhi when I was 10 years old, it was suddenly transformed into a city of violence. So if I looked out of my house, I could see on the road buses burning, tires burning, I could see broken houses, I could hear cries of people shouting, mobs coming, etc. All of that was something that really was shocking, because we live sometimes such protected lives that we don't think the violence lies so near to us. And I joined a large group of citizens who were given permission by the administration of Delhi to work with the people impacted by the violence. And I also felt very much part of it. It's strange how identity operates, because my family is a Sikh family, but we had never been particularly Sikh in anything except our name. You know, we were not religious, nothing, all of that. Suddenly, when Delhi became so anti-Sikh, we began to feel vulnerable. We suddenly realized how privileged we had been to be able to live with an identity that was accepted as a mainstream identity, because Hindus and Sikhs are very close and they intermarry a lot, unlike Muslims and Hindus where the polarities have grown over time. So for all of those reasons, I joined this group and we worked with people impacted by the violence, and my job was to take down their stories so that we could file compensation claims and so on. So when I was doing that I began to, for the first time in my life, hear stories of partition, listen to them, and that pushed me to going back to my parents, listening to their stories, and to starting to explore partition in my own family, where the big story was that my mother's brother had stayed behind in what became Pakistan. He refused to move, and he had become Muslim, and he married a Muslim woman, and he continued to live there, kept my grandmother back, and my grandmother also had to convert, so her name was Damayanti and she became Aisha. His name was Brikodar and he became Ghulam Sheikh. And I decided that if I am going to explore this history, I will go and find my uncle in Lahore and ask him his side of the story. So, you know, when you're talking about the different perspectives from which you can look at the Malabar struggle, people in different, across borders, also have a different way of looking at the same history which has impacted their lives. So that those 2 points in my life came together. The thinking on the publishing house and the working on exploring histories of partition, starting with my own family. I told you that I will tell you 3 little incidents that helped us to begin to think of our publishing a bit differently. They happened within a few years of our starting. So one day we were sitting in our office in winter when we had a group of visitors who dropped in. There were 8 women. 4 of them were traditionally dressed in the Rajasthani way, wearing a long lehenga and a covering on their head and a choli. And the other 4 were people we knew from Delhi, activists who had been working in the health movement there. They brought us a book which the village women had created in a series of workshops with their hands. The book was a book on women's bodies, and it was called Sharir Ki Jankari. And they said to us, will you publish this book for us? And they told us stories around the book, which were completely ingenious and wonderful, of how they had in health workshops discussed the subject, created the book, how because it was a book about human bodies, it was a book about health, they had actually drawn the naked body. Then they decided to test the book in the village, and they took it to the villagers, and everyone said to them, this is completely unrealistic. You never see a naked person in a village. So how can you call this realistic? So they had to think of how to work to say what they wanted to say, but also to maintain the cultural kind of acceptability for their book to be picked up by people. And what they came up with was a really ingenious solution of drawing the pictures of both men and women, fully dressed as they dress in the village. So the man was in his dhoti, which is, like you wear, I think the veshti, it's a dhoti, and safa on his head. And the woman was fully dressed in her traditional clothes. And then you had little flaps that you could open, and you could see how their bodies were made from inside, and then you could cover up the flap so that on the surface it all looked very, very discreet and very, very modest. And we were enthralled by this book. We were enthralled by the intelligence, the ingenuity, the thinking that had gone into it, and we decided that we would publish it. And the women said to us that we will impose 2 conditions on you to publish this book. One of them is that 75 of us work to create this book. We want all 75 names as authors on the cover. So what do? We are all taught that you have to have 1 author, 2 authors. Even you will know in academic citations, after 3 authors, you don't mention their names, right? So we thought about this and we said, okay. And the other condition they imposed was that we could sell the book for a profit, but not to a woman from the village. If we worked with village women, it would have to be at cost. So what we did was we kept, the front cover of the book only had the title of the book on it. The back cover had all 75 names. So you had to turn it around and you had to open the whole thing to see all 75 names. They were very happy with that. And over the years, this book has sold and sold and sold, but it has never sold through a bookshop. You will understand this because in Kerala, the models of selling books are very different from the mainstream models where you go through a distributor, you give them a huge discount, you go to a bookshop, etc. This book sold directly to women from villages. And they call it Apni Kitab and own it, and it works for them. Until today, we continue to sell it. That incident made us realize how deep the desire for self-expression was, the wish to write, the wish to communicate, and how it need not be limited to women like me, English-speaking, upper class, etc., etc. So we started to actively look for voices from other parts, other languages, other classes, other castes of India. 2 other incidents happened. One day we found a book. We found a reference to a book in a BBC news item, a book written by a domestic worker. who had, like many millions of Indian women, had a terrible life, been married at 12, become a mother by 13, had an abusive and alcoholic husband, and who had 3 children in quick succession. So by the time she was 13, she was a mother. One day, unable to bear the violence, she picked up her children and she left the house. She got onto a train from Howrah to Delhi without a ticket. She came to Delhi, where her brother was located somewhere. She found him by chance, and she tried to make a life in Delhi. And eventually, after much hardship, she ended up as a domestic worker in the house of the grandson of a really well-known Hindi writer. The Hindi writer is called Premchand. You may have heard Premchand's name. His works have been translated a lot, and they are also prescribed. He died long ago in the 1930s. So she ended up working in the house of his grandson, who was a literary man and who saw the attention she paid to his books. And he encouraged her to read. He actually noticed her. Like, we don't notice domestic workers in our homes because they are like a part of the furniture. He noticed her, he noticed how much she loved his books. And then, after encouraging her to read, one day he gave her a notebook and a pen, and she said, "What should I do?" And he said, "You write your life." So she wrote her life, and we found a reference to that book in a BBC News item. And we went to hunt her out and find her, and we asked her if we could do the book in English translation. And we did that, and that book became an international bestseller. It's also translated into Malayalam and many Indian languages. So that was another thing that made us realize that even if you are not literate, it doesn't mean that you don't have anything to say. And the third incident that I will tell you, that how much time do you want me to speak? Yeah, I don't want to get people bored, so please start waving if you get bored. Then I will quickly conclude. So the third story comes from your neighboring state, Tamil Nadu, where there is a really well-known writer called Salma. I don't know how many of you have heard of Salma. Her real name is Rokaya, but Salma is a name she uses for writing. It's a pseudonym that she uses. Salma's story is like this, that she belongs to a fairly small, very tightly knit Muslim community in Tamil Nadu, whose men, like many communities in Kerala, go to the Gulf to work. The women stay behind, unlike in Kerala, where the women also go to the Gulf to work, and they go to many places to work. But in Tamil Nadu, in this community, the women stay behind, and the girls, now I think it has changed, but at some stage, they are brought out of school and kept at home to be married. So Salma had to leave school when she was 12 or 13, and she was in her home for about 7 or 8 years before she was married. During this time, Salma was really, really desperate to study. So her mother and her brother, who were the people who kept her at home because they were responding to social pressures and to what was customary in that community, but they were also very sympathetic to her. They were sympathetic to her desire to study. So the brother, who was a writer himself, brought lots of books into the house, and Salma read. She read and read and read, and then she started to write. The mother took her writings, which were mostly poems, and smuggled them out of the house and had them published under the pseudonym Salma, so nobody would know who it was, in magazines and so on across Tamil Nadu. And in the Tamil literary world, there was this mysterious woman, nobody knew who it was, who was writing, everybody was reading her, but no one actually knew who she was, what her real name was. Then Salma wrote a novel, and the novel went to a publisher in Chennai and Nagarkoil to be published. The publisher is called Kalachuvadu. Some of you may have heard of him. It's run by a man called Kannan Sundaram. And Kannan published the book. We heard about it from somewhere, and we approached Kannan and said, can we publish it in English? And he said yes, and we published Salma's book in English. And once again, that book went to many places, but also what it did was it launched Salma as a writer in the national world, because even though in Tamil she might have sold much more than she sold in English, but the English language has an importance and a value that sadly Indian languages don't have. And that is the inequality of the publishing world. So you may do just 1,000 copies in English, but it will get talked about, whereas you may do 30,000 in Tamil and it will not reach the national stage. So Salma became a well-known writer. When her book was published in Tamil by Kannan, that was the time that she decided that it was time now to reveal her identity. So she and her mother together went to Chennai for the launch of the book, but they told the family that they were basically going because she needed a medical checkup. And then the next day the book was in the newspapers, and when they came back, it was not very nice for them. They had a very, very difficult time, but over a period of time, Salma has become an important political figure and a writer, and the family is now accepted it and is happy with it. So these kind of incidents pushed us into thinking beyond English, and we started to do books in translation from Indian languages. We also started to look actively for women who were not of the same kind of class and who came from the Indian languages. So Baby, for example, is a low caste woman, and we were happy to publish her book. But one of the things we realized was that when you are making this kind of change, or when you're trying to make this kind of change, it is not enough to publish voices that are different, because actually the market is so shaped and dominated by things that are supposed to dictate what is good writing, what is the canon, which writer will be considered, etc., that without educating the market, you cannot expect them to accept, you cannot expect people to accept new kinds of writing, to give them the respect that it deserves, and so on. So that was another learning, and we had to start doing a lot of public work to make our writers feel that this marginalized voices were voices that they should be reading, they could be reading, there's a lot to learn from there, and that thing is still ongoing. I want to mention a couple of other things that happened. At some stage, we began to question ourselves again. And this time the questions were different, because you can call yourself a publisher of marginal voices, but actually, and you can call yourself a feminist publisher. But actually, what does that mean if the people inside the publishing house who are making the choices still are upper class and upper caste? So if I am the one who is the chief editor and I am selecting all the books that are going to be published, and I am not willing to give up that power to people who are from those communities and who know the literatures much better, then what kind of change am I making? So we started to question ourselves on this, and we started to question ourselves on the people we employed. You know, now all of you must have been reading about the caste census from Bihar. It has told us what all of us instinctively knew, that the lower caste communities, the OBCs, they are the people who are many, many more in number. And yet the top posts everywhere are held by a very small, very powerful upper caste minority. So even in our publishing house, when we started to look at ourselves, we realized that we had not actively sought out upper caste people, but we had ended up with a workforce that was largely upper caste. So then we decided to change that. And we decided we are only a 10-person company, so it's very small. But now all our jobs there are reserved. They are reserved for people from the trans community, the queer community, the Dalit community, for OBCs, and so on and so forth, and of course for women. So to give women all those skills. And in a sense, making that change has transformed the way in which we think of what we publish. Because now everything that we select is held up to scrutiny by our colleagues who are saying, why this, why that, why not this, why not that? And also, we decided to not keep the power to select in the hands of one person. So we have a collective selection of manuscripts in our office. Every colleague has the freedom to say, I suggest you publish this. This is where you can get it. This is how you can get it. So I have for a while now been saying that we should be publishing some Adivasi voices. And the other day, one of my colleagues sent me a wonderful manuscript in Hindi by an Adivasi writer saying, this is what we should be doing, and I will connect you to this writer. So for us, that is the opening up of that. Now, when you're doing this kind of thing and this kind of publishing, survival is very difficult because where does the money come from? You know, when you're publishing big writers, I mean, if we were publishing Shashi Tharoor, for example, we would have no problem. We would make a lot of money. But we don't publish Shashi Tharoor, partly because he's a man, but also because Shashi Tharoor doesn't need a publisher like Zuban. You know, he has all the big publishers chasing him. But it's not the kind of book that we would do. So how do you survive? How do you make money? And there, I think the questions become that you have to think of success differently. You have to think that success is not about money. As long as we are paying our employees okay, success can be just about breaking even. It can be just about earning enough to take the next step. But it does not have to be about putting money in your pockets. So all of us are agreed on that we don't want to fill our pockets. We don't want to make a huge profit. But we do want to survive. And therefore, we have to work hard to earn the money that will give us survival. And sometimes if we can't do it from the publishing, then we will take on a consultancy or something like that and put that money into the publishing. But we have a budget that each year we have to earn so much money just to survive. So survival is difficult, but the other issue that is there is that, you know, it is by and large independent publishers who do all the hard work and research of looking for new voices. Big publishers who have all the resources and deep pockets are not interested in investing in bringing out new voices. But once that new voice has acquired some public mileage, they are very good to step in. So you have this issue all the time that you start publishing, you put a lot of effort into take Salma as an example. When we published Salma, nobody was interested in doing her in English. She was completely unknown. That one book brought her into the public world and everybody started to chase her. So then the question you have to ask yourself is this a betrayal? Or is this actually what you set out to do, which is to mainstream women's voices? And if you can do that, it's fine. Those writers will go. Why should they not earn more money? Why should they not get more exposure? To me, as a publisher and as a feminist, this, I have to say, has not been an easy battle. Because many of the women I publish are women who are politically my comrades. and women I know well. And when they move to the big commercial publisher, my heart breaks. It's like I think this is really a betrayal, but it's taken me time to tell myself that this is what you really want to do, that this is what you have to do. One last thing in the publishing is that we also, we started translating from Indian languages into English. Our publishing is still mainly in English. But we also began to ask ourselves this question, that why should the translation only be one way? Why should it only be that we will pick up, let's say, a Malayalam manuscript and publish it in English, or a Tamil one, publish it in English? Why should it not go the other way also? But we also understood that in going the other way, you're going from a powerful language which is well resourced to languages which may not have the same kind of resources. So we went out and looked for money, and we managed to persuade, I don't know how we did it, we managed to persuade a literary foundation in Kolkata to give us some money to translate our content into Indian languages and to give a translation subsidy for that. So over 3 years, we have been doing this now, and so far we have succeeded in getting about 35 titles into about 12 or 13 Indian languages, which is great. But what is most important about that is that moving into Indian languages, what it revealed to me was something I had no idea of before, about the publishing landscape in so many Indian languages, where there are so many excellent, small, independent publishers who are actually doing strongly political work and who are not in it for the money. So there is a doctor in Karnataka who publishes on the side. Her name is Anupama. She runs a small publishing house called Vaishnavi Prakashan, and she does books on the side, and she uses all her own salary to do it. So this kind of contact that we made was something very, very interesting for us. And Yuvatha books I have just discovered, so that is also something to think of. I have been looking up their list on the net. I am amazed at how cheaply those books are priced and how well that's done. So these are the kinds of connections. So the journey is actually a learning journey. It isn't a journey that is ever completed. And as these learnings entered my personal journey as a publisher, similar learnings were present in the work that I was doing as a historian, working with memory and oral history. And I will just mention that, give you a couple of incidences and conclude so that we can actually have a conversation. But I went into the history of partition. As I said, I went, first started exploring the family history. And with the family history, my first step was to locate my uncle, my mother's brother, who was living in my grandparents' house in Lahore. So I went to Lahore, and I just turned up at his house at night, rang the doorbell and said, actually, I'm your sister's daughter, and I have come from India. He's a Pakistani citizen. He is dead now, but the welcome that I got was incredible. It was like it was 10 at night. You have a stranger turn up at your door. You've never seen that before, that person before. The stranger is from what is considered, within quotes, an enemy country, and yet you open your door wide. So my uncle was not there when I went. His wife, his daughter-in-law, his daughter, they were there. And they were so welcoming. And then my uncle came back at night. I had left by then. He called me and he said, you have to come here. This is your home. I went and stayed with him, and we began talking. And we began talking across the boundaries of India and Pakistan, across the boundaries of religion, about a history that we had both lived through very differently. And that's when I began to realize that history can look so different, even to people from two sides. I was also really, really happy, even though my mother initially was very hesitant to open up to her brother because she felt betrayed by him. But I was so happy that I had acquired a family across the border, and that family was Muslim, because in some ways all of us are separated by these artificial boundaries of religion, but there are so many interconnections. And it is also so interesting how history works, because those interconnections to me, when I acquired a whole family of cousins, my uncle, the cousins' children, and Pakistan and Lahore became another home that I visited all the time. But now, that familial relationship even is something that can land you in all kinds of difficult positions, because interreligious connections have become so polarized in our country. So it's so interesting how family relationships also are shaped by historical kind of development. I also, because I came from the women's movement, I went into the history of partition as a feminist looking for women's stories. And I began to find women's stories, although the first stories you always come across are those of men. So even while exploring marginal histories, I think it's always important to be aware that there are so many layers of marginalities that the first history you meet will never be the only one. So I realized talking to women that very often you cannot get women alone in a one-to-one thing. When you go to talk to somebody, the first people you will meet are the men. They will be outside the house drinking chai or something. They will talk to you. You want to see the women are working in domestic labor, they're working in the houses. They will come and talk to you when they find the time, but that time will never be at a stretch. It will always be truncated. Somebody will interrupt, some child will want food. And if the man is sitting there, then their speech will also be constrained by what the man is saying. So I was very foxed by this, how to deal with this, until I began to read about conversations with women. And I read a piece that said that when you talk to women, you have to listen to what they say and what they don't say. So you have to listen to the speech, and you have to listen to the silence, and you have to listen to the body language, and you have to understand that often women do not have the vocabulary to talk about certain things. Some things will always remain silenced, they will always remain unspeakable, and therefore how to communicate with women. But even then my understanding was limited, that there is an experience of men, there is an experience of women. I did not explore family histories until I came upon one by accident, and that is when I discovered that in Sikh families, by and large, there had been a lot of violence against women of their own family in that family. So when you look at violence, you often imagine it as coming from the outside. The other community is the violent one. Your self-image is of yourself as a non-violent kind of person. So it's very comfortable to locate the violence elsewhere. But I came across so many stories of Sikh families who had killed their own women because they felt that the women could be abducted, they could be sexually assaulted, and if that happened, then somehow the religion would become impure, it would be impacted. So that the women's bodies became a way of keeping the religion pure, and that meant that you sacrifice the women. So when I came across these stories, it really shocked me, and it began to change the way I understood violence. I also found children in a similar way, but I won't go there because that'll take too much time. I will conclude only by saying that the last kind of surprise story that came to me was that of caste. So while I had started to explore the marginal histories of partition, I never thought that those marginal histories hid another margin, that was the margin of caste. And I came across it completely by accident when I was interviewing a sweeper woman in a college which was near the border, India-Pakistan border, and she said to me that when partition happened, at first there would be a rumor, because border villages, you did not know till the last minute who they were going to go to. That there would be a rumor that it would go to Pakistan, all the Hindus would run away. Then another rumor that it would go to Hindustan, all the Muslims would run away. And so I said to her, but what about you? She said, I and my friends, we would jump into every house that was abandoned, and we stole a lot of things, and we made our dowries, and we got quilts, and we got utensils. And I said, but how did you not face the violence? And she said, because we are not Hindu or Muslim, we are Dalit. And somehow that dimension had never struck me. Then I started to explore it, and I found there is a rich, rich history which still needs a lot of exploration of how caste played out during partition. And one of the things I learned was that Dalits in Punjab had actually demanded a homeland of their own, just as Muslims had and Hindus had. And they had quite a large percentage there, they had a geography there, and of course Ambedkar was around at the time. So all of these things worked together to create a caste experience of partition. So in a sense, the parallel journeys of the publishing, where the margins were opening up in different ways, and the parallel journey of my work on partition, where the margins were opening up in different ways, are what actually connected and led me to, I think, understanding how rich a seam this is to explore, how much lies in stories, how much lies in people's histories, how much lies in the different perspectives. Because then, if you're exploring partition, which today is receiving official recognition, which it never had, but only in terms of its horrors and not in terms of its solidarities. So I think it's really important when you're making that kind of exploration to see the many, many different perspectives, which also comprise not only the negative aspects of those history, but also the solidarities, the friendships. And if I had not become an old woman, now I've become an old woman, but if I had not, if I still had another few years, that is what I would love to look at the friendships across borders, at how marginal communities help to sustain the relationships between communities. And similarly, in the publishing, that is what I would like to do, to build more connections, not with English publishers, but with publishers that lie outside the mainstream and that do different kinds of work. And therefore, I am really happy to have been asked here at the launch of the book that we will be launching this afternoon, because to me, that really embodies everything that has been really close to my heart in the last so many years. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much for listening to me.